They cry, peace, peace, when there is no peace. I'm Tom Arthur, and I'm the pastor of Sycamore Creek. And if you are watching right now, give us a shout out in the comments. Let us know that you are there. And we would love to we got people showing up. Share this out, like it, subscribe to the group. We want to know that you're there. So feel free to drop some questions or comments. Tonight, we are talking about some serious stuff. It's going to get perspective-y tonight. Be kind to each other in the comments, okay? We're going to be kind to each other here on the screen.
Yes.
So be sure to like the Congregation's Organizing for Racial Reconciliation Facebook page. Again, share this out. Let's see those shares going up so that we get this conversation out there. So I told you I'm Tom Arthur. I'm the pastor at Sycamore Creek. And I'm here with two of my dear friends and colleagues in Lansing. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Pastor Kurt Wright from Crossroads Church on the edge of Old Town in Lansing.
Pastor Coye Bouyer, Kingdom Life Church, right here. I guess you could say like close to downtown, but on the south side of Lansing.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, you may notice that this is called Perspectives. 4 pastors talk about race, and there's only 3 of us. Luis is not able to join us through this run of episodes, and we're missing him dearly because he probably fixed all of our problems and figure it out for us. But tonight, as if talking politics is not hard enough, on the eve of the election, tomorrow night, we're going to talk about how you apply biblical principles to this conversation, and specifically individual policy platforms of each party. Tonight, we're talking about the second of 2 policy issues that so many Christians believe dictate how one should vote. I guess how a Christian should vote. Last week, we talked about abortion. And tonight, we're talking about human sexuality. We're just, guys, I don't know how you talked me into this because I don't ever talk about these things publicly, or at least not like this.
I'm asking myself the same question.
It was Coye.
Especially not like this.
It was Coye.
Yes.
We've been having this conversation about human sexuality privately for several years, but here we are doing it publicly. So we would love, by the way, if you're out there listening, to give us a shout out. I see Cindy is there, Lauren, Jesse. Thanks. Be sure to share this. Be sure to share this video out. All right. Let's get those views up and like it. So, all right, Pastor Coye is going to answer all your questions tonight. If you'll just sign on the dotted line. So, Coye, there you go. Tell us.
I get to take it away now, huh?
Take it away.
All right. So last time we were together over the last couple of weeks, but last week in particular, we talked about, of course, those hot button issues. We started to talk about them. And one of the things that I have said and have been saying is I see a lot of hypocrisy on both sides, the DNC and the RNC, with regards to policies and platforms that they stand on, and then other policies and platforms that they may stand on, or we'll say particular practices in which they like to lean on. So last week we talked about whether or not the RNC was truly pro-life or if they were just anti-abortion. And I don't know that we put it in those words, but that is pretty much kind of how I feel as I look at the different policies and platforms and the practices of those who are usually involved in those particular parties. For today or tonight, we're going to look at one that is a little bit more challenging, because I can really stand up, and most Christians would stand up and say, hey, abortion is wrong in most cases. And we recognize that there are some exceptions that people would say demonstrate grace or mercy in those situations. But generally speaking, we can talk about, just unborn babies being killed as something that is sinful. But tonight, we talk about human sexuality, LGBTQ+, I think I said that correctly, and then this biblical concept or the definition of marriage. And what's interesting about this one is, and I want to be clear tonight as I make these statements, because I want everybody to hear my heart, but also hear kind of some of the research in which I have done in preparation not only for tonight, but for my own congregation. So let me just simply say this, starting off by saying, hear my heart, especially those of you who are Christian, who might not like what I'm about to say. All right. So first and foremost, I am one who believes that homosexuality is a sin. I believe the Bible specifically says it. That is how I interpret it. And so I'm going to speak from that vantage point, as if from the vantage point that homosexuality biblically is a sin. It's a level of, it's something that is immoral. That being said, when I look at the RNC's platform, and the RNC spends a lot of time talking about, they are the party that really goes back to the Constitution and its principles. In fact, they will mention it in several of their policies about, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And in one of them, they even say that life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And so it's this constant kind of reiterating of these three things, or this concept of this right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. However, when it comes to the concept of sexual morality and the definition of marriage, what's interesting is they now want to take away somebody's God-given right and constitutional right to choose something that they want to do where it is not really imposing on someone else's pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. See, if two individuals want to get into a civil union, or, i.e. what is normally called marriage for us today, especially as Christians, these are two people making a decision to actually come together and say, hey, we're going to be husband and husband, wife. I don't know how that is said. I probably sound so insensitive right now, but I'm gonna carry on. All right.
Husband and husband, wife and wife. That's
okay. Okay, great.
Yeah,
great.
no, you got it right.
Got it. I got it right. Cool. All right, cool. So what we see here is we see that a lot of people in the RNC, we see a lot of Christians condemning this behavior or this act of civil unions or marriages because it is immoral. And while many Christians will stand up and say it is immoral, at the end of the day, it's not illegal. And so the Constitution is very, very clear. It pretty much communicates that as long as you and I are not invading on someone else's inalienable rights or right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and as long as what we're doing is not criminal, then our own pursuit of this happiness and our own pursuit of life and liberty and property and who I want to be with is given to me as an American citizen, because constitutionally, that's what the Constitution says. So what often happens in our society today is Christians try to bring a theocratic principle into a democratic society, not recognizing that when you have a democratic society, you cannot then incorporate theocratic principles and then decide what should be illegal and legal based upon theocratic principles when a democratic society says, hey, this is what we want to do. When democratic society says life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. For the RNC, you cannot say that on every situation. And then when you get to this one, take away somebody's constitutional right. I'm going to pause there. Thoughts?
Let me just ask a clarifying question. And then see if I'm reflecting back what you're saying here. When you say homosexuality is a sin, you're saying that the practice of homosexuality is a sin. You're not saying that someone who has same-sex attraction is inherently sinful in some way in experiencing that, or are you?
No, I would say the homosexual act is sinful. I would say that just like I can lust after a woman, a man lusting after a man, a woman lusting after a woman in their minds or in their hearts, that would be sinful too. But the same way it would be sinful for me to lust after a woman who is not my wife.
And so then yes, I think that you're saying then that in the way that applies from that Christian conviction into the political realm is that as a Christian, we don't expect the political system to uphold all of the Christian convictions about what righteousness is and make things that are considered unrighteous illegal.
That is correct. Because if you're going to say that marriage can only be defined as a man and a woman based on biblical principles, which again, theocratic principle, if you're going to say that, then that's a morality issue, which now you got to say all sexual immorality is illegal. Adultery, fornication, pornography, sex trafficking, which we know is illegal, but now all of a sudden you can't pay $20 for, in a sex parlor, and we got video of it, but you get to get off.
Yeah. This is where it gets tricky, I think, is where does, how do our Christian convictions about right living, get played out in a democratic system.
Yes.
Where
exactly.
where do they, how do they influence that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Well, and somehow in some ways, what we do is we pick the particular immoral sexual sins that we just think are so debased and so bad, and we want to make those illegal. And so, because of how homosexuality is seen, how it's spoken about in the Bible, I think how it is perceived by individuals, just period, especially those who are very, very conservative and Christian, and understandably so. We picked that one out, but I'm here to tell you, pornography, fornication, adultery, all that stuff is immorality when it comes to sexuality. And so same-sex marriage, as immoral as I may believe that it is, it's not illegal. And if I'm gonna make that illegal, I gotta make a lot of sexual sins illegal. And trust me, Christians don't want to do that either. They don't want to start making those types of sexual sins illegal, because that's going to definitely invade on their pursuit of happiness, life, and pursuit of well-being.
Well, that's where we get into what I was calling not a theocracy, but a interpretocracy, where one person's interpretation of what's right or wrong becomes the law of the land.
That's a good. That is true. And so for the sake of this particular conversation, like, because I don't. There are certain things that I think in the Bible it's kind of clear. Like, this is what it says. Doesn't mean there are some gray areas with it. There are gray areas, I think, with a lot of rules and principles. But the reality of it is there are certain rules that are just very, very clear. But I don't want to necessarily say, oh, people's interpretation may be wrong, because that's true. Interpretation may be wrong, but just practically speaking, in this case, regardless to interpretation, constitutionally, you have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We are a democracy, not a theocracy. And so for me to impose my religious views, personal convictions, as strong as they may be, on someone else who doesn't have those same religious views or convictions, then I'm denying them their inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
And I think, again, I'm going to bring this conversation is going to be hard at times to engage the question of race and racism, but I want to bring it back to that as often as we can, because that's really what the framing of this is. You're saying that as someone who, from a historical perspective, somebody's interpretation of scripture kept you from having those rights, those basic human rights, or your ancestors, because they interpreted the Bible in a certain way that allowed for slavery and segregation and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just you've experienced especially, but we as a nation have experienced that original sin, so to speak, of using one interpretation of the Bible to hurt other people, really.
Sure. Yeah.
So I just want to say a couple of things. One is, right off the bat, I want to name my reluctancy to this conversation, because no, for real, because my heart is to love God and love people, which is to give truth, but in a pastoral, relational way. That's what I've been called to do. And I feel particularly called to speak to the masses when it comes to race, but not as much this issue, because I'm not as steeped in it. But beyond that, when it comes to how do you apply the Bible to the law, that's the next step of confusion. I feel confident applying the Bible to my life and the people that have said, hey, that's my pastor, and how do we live this out from day to day? I have a lot more confidence there. It gets tricky when trying to make, I think anyone's going to vote. I think anyone should vote based on their biblical convictions. Given, I think what you're saying is, when you look at both of them, you can't just do that real easily and clearly.
That's right.
And that's the dilemma we're in.
Yes.
So, I think the main point here is I'm tracking with your logic as far as, like, Christians have not been consistent as far as how they've dealt with sexual sin. They have not been consistent at all. And that is a travesty and something we evangelical Christians need to repent of and say, we're sorry. We are sorry. That's horrible that we would take one group of people and say, that's the worst kind of sin. That's totally wrong. But so that's a great point. And then second of all, though, my point would be the redefinition of marriage. Not so much like what's legal, what's not legal. Of course, obviously it gets into it in marriage. And so one of my thoughts of that would be, so for the first time, you know, in our history of a country, marriage has been redefined and more inclusive. So then that assumes that marriage is definable by the government, which it is definable by the government, and it opens the door to be redefined ongoing. So up until this point, it really hasn't been redefined, and now it has been, and it will continue to be redefined. And so as a Christian that sees when they ask Jesus about marriage, I think this is one of the most convincing biblical hermeneutics for me is when they ask Jesus about marriage, he says a man and a woman, they'll leave their parents and be united in one flesh. And he's quoting Genesis, and he doesn't quote just Genesis 2:24 and say the two will become one flesh. He also quotes Genesis 1:27 and that God made them male and female.
Sure.
The words of Jesus seems to connect back to this. So that's my definition of marriage. So when the government changes the definition that I uphold in Scripture, I'm okay with it legally. I'm okay with that being legally. I would have to disagree. I just have to disagree with their definition. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. I don't know that the big issue is whether or not we agree with the government's definition of marriage. The government can come up with whatever definition they want for marriage. That's what democracies do. I think that what I'm starting to see is we try to bring this particular principle or this platform agenda idea, and as Christians, we try to make it fit our theological construct or our biblical context. And you can do that for yourself, and you could do it in a theocratic run society where God rules the table. But we have decided as a nation from day one that God would not rule the table. God can be a voice at the table, but he does not run it. And God has said, I'm not going to be a voice at the table. I'm not going to be a seat at the table. I'll rule it or I'll let you run it. And we have decided that we're going to run it. So when you run it, then as a nation, the nation can decide, they can redefine whatever they want to redefine. And that really shouldn't change how you and I define it as Christians. That shouldn't necessarily change how we function, even as Christians, with regards to the concept of marriage, or even what we still preach from our pulpits. But when we try to use this as the reason why, you got to vote this way, well, you're trying to bring theocratic principles into a democratic society. And it's just not going to work. Because if you do that, what ends up happening is now you are denying people, and please hear me, because this is hard for me to say, but in all my research that I've done so far, where I'm at so far, you deny people of their constitutional right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to deny someone their constitutional right in our country, right now, people are mad at our governor and tried to kidnap her because they've stolen our constitutional right to meet in church. Somebody told me that, and they're like, well, they've imposed on our constitutional right. Have they really? If that's the case, they've imposed on every business owner's constitutional right. They're just simply asking for us to take some precautions. The government has the right to do that in a in a democracy, and they haven't really taken our constitutional right, yet we're acting like they have. And so in this case, we talk about taking people's constitutional rights, and we seem okay with doing that when it comes to this issue of marriage, civil union, or just for lack of a better term, two men or two women wanting to have the benefits of a marriage relationship in a democratic society. And I'm stuck. I see the difficulty and the dichotomy of what is taking place here. It's like, man, we want it to be a theocracy, but it's not. It's a democracy. You can't deny somebody their right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness because you think what they're doing is immoral. It's not illegal. And we're trying to make it illegal.
So some of the things as I'm listening to you too, and of course we've been listening to each other for many years now. Although it's really interesting to do this because we listen to each other differently when we're doing this, and we say different things than when we're kind of behind the scenes. But Kurt, I really appreciate your sort of sensitivity to the pastoral needs of perhaps the LGBTQ people in your community, and you're concerned that by talking publicly about this, you might damage or do harm. And that resonates with me. You're not a reckless person. You're not a reckless pastor. You're a caring, loving, grace-filled person. Now, on this issue, I'm going to disagree with you, but I wanted to start with the appreciation I have for you, because sometimes I think we sort of cast somebody in a frame, disagreement, and add a lot of different things. And Coye, as I listen to you, one of the things I really appreciate is this sort of challenge that you are taking in a democracy to try to create space. And in this whole conversation that we've had, this whole series of episodes is really around you, Coye, a friend of yours, saying that if you're a Christian, you have to vote Republican. And this like went you down the road of like looking at the policies and the platforms and preaching a series on it and trying to create space that abortion and homosexuality or the human sexuality, that Christians can disagree politically without like kicking each other out of the church.
Right.
You're kind of creating space for somebody like me to be in your church and to disagree with you. And although it sounds like we might go in a similar direction about how the policy plays out, without questioning or getting at the heart of the thing that we hold in unity, and all three of us agree on, is Jesus. And,
Amen.
And we all would hold those sort of basic Trinitarian historical creeds and biblical expressions of who Jesus is.
Yes.
Definitely.
So the one thing, Coye, that I hear in you, so I told you all this before, but when I listen to Kurt, I hear myself like maybe about 15 years ago. And Coye, I hear in you myself about 10 years ago. And I started out in a evangelical. I'm still want to claim evangelical, even though, like, I don't know, white evangelical has become so politicized now. But I want to claim that still, because I don't want to let go of it. Evangelism, Jesus, like those are really important to me. The classic evangelical practices of regular scripture reading and reading the Word of God, those are so fundamental to me. The preaching of the Word and so on. But there was a tension that I see in what you're talking about, Coye, that I couldn't maintain. And eventually I moved from holding kind of a very traditional view of both human sexuality and marriage, and a traditional political view that it should not be given any kind of political acknowledgement and the benefits that come with that, to a place kind of, Coye, where maybe I'm hearing you at that, well, maybe we could have civil unions or something else. Maybe it should be called something different than marriage. As Kurt was talking about, like we've taken that word and redefined it. And I've over the years moved to a position where I personally and my church affirm fully the LGBTQ person and their desire to be in a covenant relationship representing the covenant that God has with us, and that covenant relationship to be a relationship of discipleship and following Jesus together. So that movement was not a movement taken lightly. In fact, I showed this before we went on air. This is my stack of books that I have read, or it's not quite all of them, but I just lift this up because sometimes I need to work my biceps while I'm sitting here and get some reps in. But I share that not to say like, look how smart I am or something, but really just, and I'm sure you all have read books too. My point is just simply to say, like, this isn't a decision that was made overnight. It was a thoughtful, reflective, biblical and theological decision over really a couple of decades. And the way that race played in for this, in fact, this was almost the deciding factor for me, was when I started, after soaking in all of this and feeling like the main thing I felt like after reading all of this that I could come down to was that thoughtful people that I value disagree. Like, that was as much as I felt like I could say after reading all that. But then I kept going down this road of race and racism and studying how Christians have read the Bible in that. And I found that that Christians read the Bible in a certain way. They had a biblical hermeneutic, an interpretive framework that they brought to the Bible. And sometimes Christians are not always, I think, completely either honest or self-aware of the interpretive framework that we bring to the Bible. You don't just read the Bible without like some sort of lenses on, something that colors it. And of course with race, like, white Christians in America have read the Bible over our 400 years or however many it is now, in a way that has done a lot of damage to Black people in the Black community. And when I go back and actually read what they wrote and how they were like interpreting the Bible, I saw in the hermeneutic they were using the same hermeneutic I was using to make the distinctions that you two are making. And eventually I had to give it up. And then came, through that was like the work of like, well, how do you understand individual scriptures and that sort of thing, which I'm more than happy to talk about, but that we're not really in that kind of a conversation, but I'm willing to talk about it. So in this sense, race was really influential. The deeper that I got into racism and anti-racism and studying race, the more open I became to an interpretive framework of reading the Bible in a way that I could not only support civil unions or so on, legal policy that supports the benefits of marriage, but I could in the church also really support that, a full celebration of same-sex marriage and so on. Now I'm kind of being careful, like, LGBTQIA+, there's a lot of like letters in that.
Wow.
And the plus sometimes can get a lot of things that I am kind of very uncomfortable with.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not ready to fully affirm. Yeah. So, like consent, I regularly say consent is not an adequate theological or biblical like ethic of sexuality, because consent is a baseline. And just because you're married doesn't mean you don't ask your spouse for consent. And, but consent by itself, I think the cultural ethic of sex is consent.
You about to take us down another rabbit hole, man. We're gonna get in trouble tonight.
There we go. I like Vicky Cole. She says I'm listening. So thank you, Vicky, for listening.
You keep talking?
I like that, Tom, though. I like that. That's important to hear for conservative Christians, for them to hear Pastor Tom say consent isn't good enough. That's the cultural value.
Yeah.
But there's more to it than that. I think that's important.
a biblical value of sex. I mean, that's going to take a lot to unpack, but marriage is essentially is a spiritual discipline of discipleship, of becoming more like Jesus, inside of a covenantal relationship.
Yeah.
And the experience inside of that covenantal relationship of perhaps experiencing the closest thing that we have on earth in a good marriage. And now there's a lot of marriages where this doesn't play out, but I'm talking about in the marriage at its best, you experience in your spouse's unconditional love of you, or about as close as you can experience on earth, I think, to the unconditional love that God has for you. And the more that I have ministered to and gotten into, and our church is opened up to the LGBTQ community, which we have this group of, I call them like the gay evangelical diaspora in Lansing. And they're gay evangelicals who have not been able to use all of their gifts and talents in other churches, evangelical churches in Lansing, who through word of mouth have ended up at Sycamore Creek. They have impressed upon me the need, and helped me understand and see the need for discipleship of gay Christians as both Christian and gay, and marriage as a spiritual discipline. Like it'd almost be like saying, well, if you're gay, you can't pray because you're gay, and so you can't practice that spiritual discipline. I'm talking about right now, inside of a frame of embracing the LGBTQ community. So marriage, I want the gay Christians in my church to have the experience of discipleship inside of marriage, of following Jesus more faithfully because they're married.
Let me just ask, sincerely, a question though. Can't you have unconditional loving relationships without sex? And can't you have unconditional commitment to the body of Christ and be discipled without sexual intercourse?
Yes, on some level. But I think what's the vulnerability of taking your clothes off in front of your spouse and being seen naked and not ashamed of it? I mean, that now you're back to Genesis 1, right? Like they were naked before the fall and not ashamed, and after the fall they were naked and ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is an intimacy inside of marriage and inside of sex that isn't replicated anywhere else. And I mean, that's one of the gifts of sexuality, right? Is that intimacy and that bonding.
That is a good point. I would have to agree with that.
I hear that, but I also know the most loving, unconditional person that's ever walked this earth was a celibate Christian named Jesus. He hung naked on a cross. There's more than one way to be completely vulnerable and share your heart.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I think you bring up a good point.
That's a good point.
Definitely something that, Coye, are you going to be like the referee in between me and
No?
Kurt?
Here's the thing. I think both of you are making excellent points. I think, Tom, you're right. There's a vulnerability and intimacy and nakedness with a spouse, flat out. We've all experienced it because we all have spouses. So there is that, and there's a freedom the more you make yourself vulnerable with this spouse, because over time you are less and less ashamed, even as you get dad bodies, and our wives don't look the same after babies and everything, but you're still free to show your nakedness to the other individual. So there is a sense of vulnerability there, a sense of intimacy. I agree, but Kurt is right. You can have a level of intimacy and vulnerability and transparency, and of course grow spiritually without marriage as one of the tools that does it. So, I would say that while marriage is a great tool, if you don't have marriage, it does not mean that you cannot still develop as a disciple.
Yeah, that's something I would never want to say, is that a single person is somehow half or less than a full person, or
I
is
hope you don't say that.
less than of a
Especially
disciple.
since celibacy is a gift, and we know at times people get it.
Mm-hmm.
We would not want to act as if their gift of celibacy somehow makes them a little less sufficient or insufficient because they're not married and experiencing that.
And I think the Bible makes it really clear to be a celibate single if you can. Paul makes that pretty clear. Like if you're burning with passion, then yes, but it's actually better to be single. That's another area I think the church hasn't done a great job of, is celebrating single people and all the things they can do.
And I just announced that you can speak to this, Tom. Something else that the church has done a bad job at is we do take the practice of homosexuality, whether it's a man with a man, woman with a woman, and we elevate, or we put this particular sexual morality on a level as if it is worse than all the other ones. And I've already said, I believe homosexuality. I think that's something the Bible speaks against. I think it is an immoral practice, but I don't think it's any more immoral than fornication or adultery. And I think that God, when he sees those things taking place, he's not looking at me in fornication or adultery saying, well, it's not that bad because at least he thought about a woman. I don't think that. I think that if we're talking about sexual sin and they're all in the category of sexual sin, then God sees it all as the same type of sexual sin being just portrayed or played out in different ways.
So here's what I've come to learn or understand. The sort of deeper the relationships, and the more I've lived alongside of and ministered inside or with the LGBTQ community. And that is that I think there's a little bit of, and we haven't hit on this, of whether same-sex attraction is something that is inherent to you biologically. And this is a conversation that often happens in Christianity. And I'm not totally sure where you guys fall in this conversation, but or if this is something that you choose, that orientation you choose, I guess, to get out of it. But so saying something like homosexuality, the practice of homosexuality is a sin, Coye, is received in a very similar way, I think, to somebody perhaps in some other day and age, or maybe even right now, saying that your race, your skin color is itself a sin, or the expression of Black culture is a sin. That this is something much more inherent to it than inherent to biologically than something that you choose to do or not do. And this again is where I think the question of race comes in, and particularly like the LGBTQ community has engaged a lot of the conversation and the thought and the framework of the civil rights movement in its quest for these basic rights to seek life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Sure.
And I know that the church, particularly the Black church, and maybe not even just the Black church, but the Black community, has not always been open to the use of civil rights ideas for engaging rights for LGBTQ people. And this plays out right now on the scene when it comes to whether the church is willing to engage with Black Lives Matter as an institution, not the sort of basic like idea, but it's a sticking point for engaging or being fully engaged with or partnering with Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter is a very wide open, affirming of non-heterosexual relationships. And that causes, I think, a lot of churches trouble. That doesn't cause my church any trouble. We can partner with them on that. There may be other issues that we sometimes struggle a little bit with, but that's not one of them. So this is where, again, I think like the intersectionality of this question of sexuality with race is very live conversation in our culture right now. And how deep like white Christians are willing to get with an institution like Black Lives Matter, or really any institution, that culturally, like the church is becoming more and more, I guess, on the sidelines. Although who knows with what the Supreme Court, makeup is now. I know in the LGBT community, there's a lot of fear right now about whether the equal marriage or marriage equality ruling is going to be overturned at some point in the future. In fact, I saw one of my LGBTQ friends post like a wedding photographer who is offering 4 free hours of wedding photography for LGBTQ communities or people before the Supreme Court overturns their marriage. I mean, there's a deep fear that these basic things of seeking life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, irregardless of the question of discipleship, that that I'm wanting to like frame this as it's not just an issue of human rights, it's an issue of discipleship and a practice of discipleship being given to or being kept.
Yeah, well, here's a couple of things that you mentioned that I don't mind commenting on, and that is, first, when the LGBTQ tries to identify with civil rights from the standpoint of the Constitution, I'm fine with that. Because constitutionally, I can see the argument, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, if you are a citizen of the United States. And no one has the right to impose that or take that away from you. So from that standpoint, they can fight from it from a civil standpoint of civil rights. But when they try to compare their life choice or even biological birth, born that way, with being Black, totally different story. Because nowhere in the text is my race or anyone's race per se the identifying marker of you are unredeemable or you are sinful and you are less than, as a human being, you're less than. There are times where God says about nations, leave them alone because they disregarded me, or I'm going to use you to judge them. But they're still human beings. And we see people in those nations that he says stay away from. He finds people to redeem from those nations to be a part of Israel and to be a part of, the kingdom agenda. So I do struggle when people in the LGBTQ community try to say this is like being Black, because it's not. It's not. There are certain places in the Bible where the practice of homosexuality is identified as a sin, along with other forms of sexual immorality, also identified as sin. And so while I understand from a civil righteousness standpoint of they're fighting for their American democratic rights. That's one thing, but don't compare it to being Black, because that is offensive to me. It's different. It's not the same thing. Similar, but not the same. So,
is that sounds like to me it's a biblical similarity or difference that you're describing?
I think so it's similar from the standpoint of you are being mistreated for a reason that you should not be mistreated in our country. And as a Black man or as a Black race, we have been mistreated in this country for reasons that we should not have been mistreated. But when it comes from a biblical theological construct, biblically and theologically, never is my race mentioned as a reason why I'm somehow thrust into less than humanity, or even being Black or any race means I'm sinful because I was born this way. And then, I will say this before, I know Kurt's going to jump in. You asked the question, but I believe it's biological. Can people be born with a propensity towards, same-sex attraction? I can't prove this, but I think it is possible. I think some people really are born with those feelings and those desires, because I was born attracted to a woman. I mean, always been there. So I think it's very much possible. But just as I have to conduct myself as a Christian based upon biblical principles with my opposite sex attraction, if I was born with same-sex attraction, there are some biblical principles, although probably more challenging than for me as a heterosexual, I would encourage people to put into practice.
Yeah, that I would answer that question. Yeah, I believe absolutely people are attracted, born either attracted to both genders or multiple genders, or absolutely. Regarding that though, I just think it's really important that, like I'm still attracted to women that are not my wife. And when I was 28 years old and not married, I was attracted to women. I wasn't married to anybody. My attraction is not what my identity is. My wife isn't even what my identity is. My identity is I'm a son of the Most High King, Jesus. That's it. That's my identity. And so we get that confused, I think. So I'm attracted to a lot of things, like sincerely. I'm seriously attracted to money. And I just know that Jesus is like, don't get tripped up on money. Don't go down that road. And it's like, it's not wrong to be attracted to money, but I can give myself over to that maybe. And I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm just saying I don't think anybody is what they're attracted to. That isn't, so yeah, and furthermore, I would say, Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow me. And what I'm hearing from I think there's like two camps, there's three camps. The far right camp that's like, oh, you're LGBTQ, you're a heathen, you're sin, and that's not right. And then on the other end, you're hearing like, be your true self, be who you are. And I'm confused by that, because what logic do we use that in any other sphere? So I'm supposed to like try to be as rich as possible because my sinful nature wants that? Like, no, deny yourself. So that's one part of it. But the other part is, I just want to say, as a conservative Christian, I will go to bat. The church needs to go fight for the safety of the LGBTQ community. I'm talking radical policy making, absolutely hate crime. Yeah, like let's go all out for their protection. They shouldn't. So I can see a similarity there a little bit between, some people were prejudice and bigotry happens for a lot of reasons, and the church needs to root that out. We're not standing for it, and we need to stand up against that. So, and then, I think, I'm kind of changing gears a little bit, but so I think we would all agree there, and that the conservative church has been silent on those issues. And then the next thing is, I think we're all in agreement of, I'm totally good and would advocate for, if two committed people legally are committed, whatever that word is, civil union, whatever, and whether they want to will something to them legally or visit them in a hospital or get an apartment and not be discriminated against, I'm totally fine with. Absolutely, we should advocate for that. Where it gets tricky when it comes to the policy, and I'm kind of all over the place, I apologize, is when it comes to like St. Vincent Catholic Charities and Bethany Christian Services right now, they're in court with the state of Michigan, and they're definitely going to lose, which is understandable. They've kind of, they're discriminating against same-sex couples under the law. And so it doesn't, that's I believe I've adopted 2 kids. That's the agency I go through with. So St. Vincent Catholic Charities is either going to say, all right, we're going to change our definition of what a family is, or they're going to say, we're not going to we can't accept any funding, or we're breaking the law. And then that agency will likely collapse. And so the definition of marriage does have implications in society. It isn't like, hey, what you do in the bedroom doesn't impact me. It doesn't, but the definition of marriage, I think, does. It has bigger implications. So I'm all about civil unions. I'm all about, man, yeah.
So here's the thing, and this will lead me to the very last point that I wanted to make actually when we started this, and that is when we talk about it from a theocratic standpoint, if God is going to rule because he rules the table, then there are certain things that we can and cannot do because there's not a democracy. He rules. But we created a democracy, okay? And creating a democracy is for the people by the people, which means people vote for what they want. They put people in office to vote the way they want those individuals to vote, and that's what it is. Well, more importantly, even God does not take away people's right to choose. And this one really struck me. In the garden, God says, hey, eat off this tree and you die. I don't want you to eat off this tree. But he let Adam and Eve make that choice. After Israel conquers the whole known world, or at least the nation as far as they would conquer it, Joshua says, choose you this day whom you will serve. God tells Israel in the desert, and then before they enter the promised land, I put before you life and death. He says, choose life, like choose life. But he does not force anybody to choose. And so when God says, hey, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, I don't want you to do this, but I want you to do this, he always leaves us with this right to choose. And so when I look at our American Constitution, when I look at the church, when I look at the fact that we're a democratic nation, then at that point, to actually say to somebody, hey, I'm going to take away your right to choose, even if I think it's sin, even if I don't agree with it, even though it will indirectly affect the society, you still have the right to choose, especially in a democracy. But even in a theocracy, you have the right to choose. The consequences just were different. And you look at America as a nation. While I compared a lot, theocracy, democracy, Israel, a lot of people will say, well, that was Israel. They were a theocracy. They chose to be a monarchy and they had all these things. But in some sense, America had the same opportunity. Those first pilgrims came over here trying to escape religious persecution, but they had a Bible in one hand, yet they created the Bill of Rights. They had all of God's commandments in the book, but they said, we'll create our own constitution. It's almost like America had an opportunity to actually say, we're going to govern ourselves the way God intended from the beginning, because we have a better handle on it with this book. And while we had the book in one hand, we made a choice. Those founding fathers made a choice to be a democracy. And while I wish we wouldn't have made that choice, while I wish we could live more under theocratic principles, the reality of it is from day one, we decided to say to God, we don't really want you to rule the table. We just want to every once in a while have your book at the table. And when you do that, and you decide that you're going to be a democracy, you cannot impose on people's inalienable rights, even when it's sinful. And God does not even do that. So if God is not going to do it, I'm finding it harder as a Christian to say, well, I'm going to take away this right from you, because in essence, I don't really think that's loving my neighbor. Sometimes loving your neighbor is loving them enough to let them choose what they want to do, and you still doing the right thing, which is honoring, respecting, and loving them in spite of what they choose to do.
So here's what I think we've been trying to do tonight. We have really tried not to debate with each other, which doesn't mean that we don't ask each other questions, but we're also trying to hear each other's heart, and not try to draw each other or describe each other in the worst possible light. We're trying to do the opposite of that, to draw and describe each other in the best possible, most graceful light, which I think, like, I don't know, that's a challenge. Like with this conversation, it's a challenge when it comes to race and racism, like of looking for the heart of the person who's saying racist stuff, even, and all of that. And, but this whole big conversation, and I think it's really intriguing to me that there's like barely any comments in the comments section.
Are you serious?
And I don't know if that's because I would be curious to hear people comment about why there's so few comments.
Why they're not commenting?
I mean, compared to last week was like a comment storm when we were talking about abortion. Does that suggest to me that there's fewer comments and fewer like people engaging in them, that this is not, that abortion is, if you were going to prioritize the issues, that there's been enough like variety or like engagement from Christians that they're just not as invested in like heated debate about this issue of human sexuality and gay marriage as they are in abortion. And there's a sort of changing tide. In fact, one of my books that I read is Homosexuality, the Bible and the Church, 4 Views, and Preston Sprinkle. I love Preston Sprinkle. What a name.
I know. Dr. Sprinkle is the conservative one.
Yeah. So he's the editor of this.
Oh, okay.
So he's not actually one of the 4 views, but in the preface to it, he says it can no longer be assumed that evangelicals agree on this issue. And he's not saying that from an affirming position.
Right.
And he's saying it from a non-affirming position. Or I don't know, he might not like that phrase non-affirming, but he's from a more traditional perspective, or from one of your perspectives. But in this conversation tonight, I hear, and really, again, from last week to this week, the polemic from the Christian right is you have to vote a certain way because of these 2 issues, abortion and sexuality, gay marriage. And if you don't vote in that way, then your Christianity is suspect. And the tenor of this conversation and last week is very different. And we're saying, I think, well, there's a lot of other things that have to be weighed, and racism is one of them. I mean, it's a huge one. It's enormous.
I think we're saying that, but I also think we're saying when you look at these 2 issues, it's not so black and white. It's not so cut and dry. There is some muddying the waters with regard to these 2 issues too. Because again, we talked about abortion as being a big issue, and I'm going to be one that would still say I think most Republicans, conservative Republicans or Christian, are really anti-abortion. They're not totally pro-life, because they will shoot you over that stuff. They will look at somebody who is being beat by the police and killed and say, well, they were a criminal. You do not value life. You value your own, and you value certain lives. And so there's some more to that issue as opposed to just abortion. And then I think even with regards to this issue, when we look at it constitutionally, if I'm going to stand up as a very conservative, staunch Republican and say, I have rights and you cannot impose on my constitutional rights. There's a group of people right now saying we should be able to go to church. Forget about what the government is saying. So forget honor and submit and respect. We're being persecuted, and we're not. And so you have this, you can't invade on my constitutional right, but then we want to impose and invade on someone else's constitutional right to choose who they want to be with. And I am a very conservative Christian, and I am Black. And while I am anti-abortion, I'm very much pro-life, womb to tomb. Okay, all life to me is important. I don't care if you're the worst of humanity, you are redeemable because God says so. And then on the flip side, I do believe in the biblical text and interpretation that homosexuality is a sin, and it should be something that is not practiced. And so I believe that, but I also recognize that the Constitution says, as a human being and as a citizen, they have this particular right. So I'm not sure that I then can impose my convictions on someone else and say, this is the right way to do it. You almost have to let people, I can't believe I'm saying this. You almost got to let people make up their own mind or do what they want to do. That's between them and the Lord.
So here's the thing though, I just hit me light bulb. I'm not saying impose either. Don't impose, no imposing. We don't impose, we vote though. That's the dilemma. So Coye, like we're trying to weigh this out of which way to vote. And most people probably know by now, it's getting pretty late to elections tomorrow, but yeah, we can't impose these things, absolutely not. And I think at the end of the day, laws they don't change hearts. They don't. So
Let me let me pose one. It's actually the only question, and it's just been posed. And then I'm looking at the time, and we should probably wrap this up so that people can.
Are they gonna ask us how we voting? Because I'm not answering that.
No. I think the question is probably more geared towards me than it is to YouTube. But Katie Marie asked, so how do y'all work through the government requiring that a pastor perform a same-sex union if it's against his, or at least in my tradition, her belief, regardless of whether or not you believe the couple should be legally allowed to get married? And I don't think, I mean, this is like, I feel like this is a boogeyman on the sort of religious liberty side of things. I'm not, well, I probably shouldn't have phrased it that way because that's kind of a negative thing if this is something that's of significant concern for Katie. But I don't think that the government even requires me to perform interracial marriage if I thought that was wrong.
Right.
Like, there are Christian pastors who still think that you shouldn't marry across race, and the government doesn't make them perform biracial marriages. So it seems now I totally disagree with that. Like, I'm not
right, absolutely right.
But I think probably all three of us would say that the government shouldn't impose on any pastor who they're marrying or not marrying.
No.
And if the government isn't imposing on us around interracial marriage, why would we be afraid that the government would impose on us when it comes to
same-sex
marriages?
Yes.
I do think that a pastor should have that that conviction. I mean, that's a lot of what kind of.
Yeah, because I won't marry if I don't think you would be good together because you can't make it. Like, there's some issues. I won't marry you then either. Forget about same-sex, interracial. If I think that you're not gonna make it and you don't want to go through the process, and I'm like, man, there's some issues here because I've done that before. There was an individual, and I was like, I don't know that I can marry y'all for these reasons, and I gave them. But I'll tell you something else though. If I, as a pastor, I work for the state, or I work in an office where I have to sign marriage license, if it is legal for same-sex marriage, then I either need to get a new job or sign that document. Flat out. Now, personally, I'd probably get a new job because I wouldn't want to sign a document. I would feel like I was attaching myself to something that I'm personally convicted by. But the only time I think as a pastor I would be forced to do something that went against maybe that particular conviction, it wouldn't really be in my church. It would be if I had some type of job that I had to now validate or sign or affirm this. And I think that pastor needs to strongly consider that. And again, you may have to get a different job.
You know what? This has opened a whole other can of worms, but I really don't want to sign marriage licenses at all. I really don't want to be a representative of the state. I never tell couples this because they wouldn't understand what I'm talking about at all. So in some sense, I'm very cowardly. I would really like for you to come to me and let's do the discipleship covenant making and then if you want a legal representation or a legal recognition of that, then you go down to the court.
Yeah.
And you get the state to do whatever the state does.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sign your marriage license. I don't want to be a representative of the state.
Absolutely.
That's a good point.
But that would be so confusing to couples. They wouldn't understand. I'd have to do so much theological and biblical information.
I just did my first marriage in the eyes of the Lord, but not in the eyes of the government. And so This is what this looked like. And this brings up a whole other can of worms too. And sorry, trying to spit this out. This couple, where they're at, he had a job. She didn't have a job. I don't want to put too much information out there. I'm trying to be wise. She had some illness. She needed her medical. She needed it. If they were to get married, they would lose their insurance. And so
Wow.
they weren't going to get married. I was like, why not? Because once the government finds out we're going to get married, we're going to lose our insurance. What's the government got to do with your covenant between you and the Lord?
Wow.
I was like, we want you to be thriving in this church. And right now it's not above reproach. I was like, I'm not going to get tripped up about a legal thing. Let's get
Right.
married. And so they were like, we can do that? I was like, my Bible says we can. We did it.
So on the weekend that right after the Supreme Court ruled on marriage equality, we were in a series about marriage. It just was a total like coincidence. And on that Sunday following the Supreme Court's ruling, I had reached out to a couple in my church, a young couple who had eloped to Las Vegas and gotten married. And I went back to them and I said, hey, what do you think about getting married again in the church, in the service? I mean, you went and did that in Las Vegas, so let's do a church service. And we got 2 church services. What do you think about doing it like twice on the same morning? And then you can invite your family and your friends to it and everything. And so they did their legal thing in Las Vegas and got married. And they came like then to the church already legally married. And then I married them again 2 times that morning. And they got married to the same person 3 times. And I loved that I didn't have to sign that document and be representative of the state.
I love that, guys. I had never even considered that, but I love that whole idea. I would definitely marry people just through the church and let them figure the legal thing out. That would actually work better for us as a church anyway.
Yeah.
Well, we've kind of gone far afield of our original conversation. So before all y'all who are watching, you signed on the dotted line, you've hung with us after 9 o'clock on the eve of the election. Before you leave, be sure to like the Congregation's Organizing for Racial Reconciliation Facebook page. That'll keep you up to date with the growing movement of anti-racist churches in the Lansing region. Guys, this is the 12th episode of Perspectives. We've full biblical 12 tribes of these, but we got to get to 144,000 to reach heaven. We got a lot of episodes left.
Yeah.
But we don't exactly know when those will be. We're going to take a break. We've been running pretty hard for several Monday nights.
Yes.
So, but if you like the Facebook page, core Facebook page, that's the way that you will stay connected. So at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to have Jonathan Tremaine, president of Civil Righteousness, on as a guest. So stay connected. Until then, be well and do good. Peace out, friends.
Love you guys. Peace.
Love you guys.